Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Queen Ælfgifu of York, a shadowy figure from late Anglo-Saxon England, whose story reminds us that the most powerful legacies often belong to those history tried hardest to forget. She lived during one of England's most turbulent periods, when Viking longships returned to terrorize coastal villages and a young, troubled king struggled desperately to hold his kingdom together. We'll softly explore the world of 10th century Northumbria, from Ælfgifu's birth into a powerful northern family, to her strategic marriage to King Æthelred the Unready in the mid-980s, to her years bearing royal children while remaining invisible at court, to the chaos of renewed Viking invasions, and finally to a quiet death and swift replacement by a glamorous Norman teenager. All while England trembled beneath the weight of renewed Viking invasions and political betrayal. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which forgotten medieval queen you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Anglo-Saxon England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Ælfgifu, later known as Queen Ælfgifu of York, entered the world sometime around the year 970 in the windswept lands of Northumbria, that ancient kingdom which stretched across what we now call northern England. The precise date of her birth has been lost to time, swallowed by the centuries like so many details of her life, consumed by the vast silence that would eventually engulf her entire existence. But we can imagine her first cries echoing through the halls of some great timber hall, perhaps in York itself, that magnificent city which the Vikings called Jorvik, and which had only recently come under West Saxon control after generations of Scandinavian rule. Let us pause here, dear listener, and paint for you a picture of York in the year 970, for this was the city where Ælfgifu likely drew her first breath, where she first opened her eyes to a world very different from our own. York was already ancient by the time Ælfgifu was born. The Romans had founded it as Eboracum nearly 1,000 years earlier, building massive stone walls that still stood in Ælfgifu's time, though crumbling now and patched with newer masonry. The Romans had built a fortress there, and temples and grand public buildings, and when they finally abandoned Britain in the early 5th century, those buildings remained, slowly decaying, but still impressive. Then came the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples who crossed the North Sea in their wooden boats and carved out kingdoms in the ruins of Roman Britain. They called the city Eoforwic, York. They built their own halls and churches within and around the old Roman walls. They established a kingdom called Northumbria that stretched from the Humber River in the south to the Scottish border in the north, encompassing modern Yorkshire and extending into what we now call Northumberland. For centuries, Northumbria had been one of the great centres of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The monastery at Lindisfarne produced the stunning illuminated manuscript we call the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Venerable Bede, perhaps the greatest scholar and historian of the early medieval period, lived and worked at the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria. Northumbrian kings ruled vast territories and patronized learning and art. It was a golden age, a time of flourishing culture and relative peace. But then came the Vikings. In the year 793, Scandinavian raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne in a terrifying assault that sent shockwaves through the Christian world. How could God allow his holy places to be violated by pagans? The attack on Lindisfarne was just the beginning. More raids followed, monasteries burned, monks killed or enslaved, treasures stolen. The Vikings, those fierce warriors from Denmark and Norway and Sweden, had discovered that Christian England was rich and poorly defended. By the 860s, the raids had evolved into full-scale invasions. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it, arrived in England in 865, with thousands of warriors intent on conquest rather than mere plunder. Within a few years, they had conquered Northumbria, killed its king, and established their own rule. York became a Viking city, the capital of a Scandinavian kingdom. The Vikings built their own settlements, established their own laws, minted their own coins bearing Norse inscriptions. For 2 generations, York remained under Viking control. The people who lived there became a mixed population, Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians living side by side, intermarrying, producing children who spoke both English and Norse, who worshipped Christ but still remembered the old gods of Asgard. The very language changed as Norse words crept into the English spoken in York. Legal customs blended Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. It was a hybrid culture, neither fully English nor fully Norse, but something new, something unique. This was the world into which Ælfgifu was born. The Northumbria of her childhood was only recently reconquered by the West Saxon kings who ruled from the distant south. Her grandfather's generation had lived under Viking rule. Her father's name, Thored, was itself of Scandinavian origin, suggesting that her family had either Viking ancestors or had adopted Norse naming customs during the long years of Scandinavian dominance. Her father, Thored, let us speak of him now in detail, for he was a powerful man, and his position shaped everything about Ælfgifu's early life and eventual marriage. Thored was styled as an ealdorman, which was the highest rank of nobility below the king himself in Anglo-Saxon England. An ealdorman was something like a duke or earl. He governed a large territory on behalf of the king, commanded the local military forces, presided over legal cases, collected taxes, and generally acted as the king's representative in his region. But Thored was not just any ealdorman. He was the ealdorman of southern Northumbria, which included York and its surrounding territories. This was one of the most important positions in all of England, for Northumbria had always been difficult for the southern kings to control. Its people were different, prouder, more independent. They had their own traditions, their own way of doing things. They remembered when they had been a separate kingdom, when Northumbrian kings had ruled from York and answered to no one in Wessex. Thored's own origins are somewhat mysterious, wrapped in the same obscurity that would later envelop his daughter. Some sources suggest he was the son of a man named Gunnar, another Norse name. Other sources claim he was the son of Oslak, a previous ealdorman of York, who had been expelled from England in the year 975 under circumstances that remain unclear. Perhaps Oslak had backed the wrong side in a political dispute. Perhaps he had been accused of treason or disloyalty. The sources don't tell us. They simply record that in 975, Oslak was driven from England, and shortly thereafter, Thored appears in the records as ealdorman in his place. The very fact that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to Thored as an eorl, using the Scandinavian word rather than the English ealdorman, tells us something important. It suggests that contemporaries saw Thored as having some connection to Scandinavian culture, whether through his ancestry or simply through his position governing a region where Norse influence remained strong. An eorl in Scandinavian tradition was a powerful warrior leader, and the chronicler's choice of this word implies that Thored fit that mold. Thored first appears clearly in the historical record in the year 966, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Thored, Gunnar's son, harried Westmoringa land. he raided Westmoreland, that wild border region between England and Scotland. This was years before Ælfgifu was born, suggesting that Thored was already an active military leader by the mid-960s, probably a young man in his 20s or 30s then, which would make him perhaps 40 or 45 by the time his daughter was born. The raid on Westmoreland is an interesting detail. Some historians have interpreted it as an act of local violence, Thored asserting his authority over a neighbouring territory. Others have suggested that Thored might have been acting on behalf of King Edgar, who ruled England from 959 to 975, and who needed to demonstrate his power in the troublesome northern regions. Either way, it tells us that Thored was a man of action, a warrior lord who was willing to use force to achieve his aims. By the late 970s and early 980s, when Ælfgifu was a child, her father Thored was fully established as one of the most powerful men in England. His name appears on royal charters, formal documents recording grants of land and privileges, witnessing alongside bishops and other ealdormen. The fact that he witnessed these charters tells us that he was part of the inner circle of English government, that he was present at royal councils, that his opinion mattered to the king. So Ælfgifu was born into power and privilege. Her father was wealthy enough to maintain a large household with many servants. He owned estates scattered across Yorkshire and perhaps into other northern territories. He commanded warriors who owed him loyalty. He dispensed justice and collected taxes and represented the king's authority across a vast region. What was Ælfgifu's mother like? Here we encounter one of those frustrating silences that characterize so much of Ælfgifu's story. Some later sources suggest that Thored's wife was named Hilda, but this comes to us through chronicles written long after the fact, and we must treat such details with appropriate skepticism. Was she of Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian origin? Was she Thored's only wife? Or did he have multiple wives or concubines, as some noblemen did in this period? Did she play an active role in managing the household and raising the children? Or did she delegate such tasks to servants while she pursued other interests? We don't know. The sources simply don't tell us. Women, even noble women, rarely appeared in chronicles unless they did something extraordinary or scandalous. A wife who simply bore children and managed her husband's household was not considered newsworthy, and so history forgot her name and her life. But we can make some educated guesses about what Ælfgifu's childhood might have been like based on what we know about how noble families lived in 10th century England. The household where Ælfgifu grew up would have been large and busy. A great lord like Thored would have maintained a hall, a large wooden building that served as the centre of his estate. The hall was where the family and their important retainers ate their meals, where Thored held court and heard legal cases, where guests were entertained and feasts were held on important holy days. Surrounding the hall would have been other buildings, storerooms for food and supplies, workshops where craftsmen made tools and weapons and cloth, stables for horses, quarters for servants and warriors. The hall itself would have been impressive by the standards of the time, though it would seem crude to modern eyes. The walls were made of timber, massive oak beams fitted together and plastered with clay or wattle and daub to keep out the wind and rain. The roof was thatched with reeds, or perhaps, if Thored was particularly wealthy, covered with wooden shingles or even clay tiles salvaged from old Roman buildings. Inside, the floor was packed earth covered with rushes that would change periodically to keep them fresh. A great fire pit in the centre of the hall provided heat and light, with smoke rising up to escape through a hole in the roof. Around the walls would have been benches where people sat during meals and meetings. At one end of the hall would have been a raised platform or dais, where Thored and his immediate family sat, looking down on the rest of the household. Hanging on the walls might have been weapons, swords and spears and shields, both for decoration and for use in case of attack. Perhaps there were also tapestries or painted cloths depicting hunting scenes or religious images. Life in such a household followed the rhythms of the agricultural year. In spring, fields needed to be ploughed and seeds planted. In summer, the crops grew and livestock grazed on pasture. In autumn came the harvest, that critical time when everyone from the highest noble to the lowest peasant worked frantically to bring in the crops before winter arrived. In winter, when the land was frozen and farming was impossible, people stayed indoors as much as possible, mending tools, spinning wool, telling stories around the fire. For a girl like Ælfgifu, daughter of one of the most powerful lords in England, childhood would have been a mixture of privilege and preparation. She would have been spared the back-breaking labour that peasant children performed from a young age, but she would not have been idle. Noble girls were expected to learn the skills they would need as adults when they married and managed their own households. Ælfgifu would have learned to spin wool, taking the raw fleece from sheep and using a drop spindle to twist it into thread. This was fundamental work, the basis of all cloth production in a world where every garment was handmade. She would have learned to weave, using a vertical loom to create cloth from the thread she had spun. She would have learned to sew, mending torn garments and creating new ones. These were not merely crafts, they were essential survival skills, things that every woman, regardless of rank, needed to know. But Ælfgifu would also have learned more refined skills, appropriate to her status. She probably learned to read, at least in Latin, the language of the church and of educated people throughout Europe. The ability to read Latin meant she could follow along during church services, understanding the prayers and psalms, even if she couldn't speak the language fluently. She might even have learned to read English, Old English, that beautiful, complex language that was the ancestor of the English we speak today. Did she learn to write? This is less certain. Writing was a specialized skill in the 10th century, usually practiced by monks and clerks who needed to copy manuscripts and keep records. But some noble women did learn to write, and it's possible that Ælfgifu was taught her letters so that she could correspond with family members or manage accounts if needed. Ælfgifu certainly would have received religious instruction. England by this time was thoroughly Christian, and even in Northumbria, where pagan Scandinavian influence had been strong just a generation earlier, the church was firmly established. Ælfgifu would have attended church services regularly, probably in York Minster, that great cathedral that had been founded centuries earlier and rebuilt and expanded over time. She would have learned her prayers in Latin, memorizing the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ave Maria, Hail Mary. She would have learned the lives of saints, the stories from the Bible, the liturgical calendar that structured the year with its festivals and fast days. She would have learned about the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, communion, confession, marriage, ordination, last rites. She would have understood that marriage was a sacred institution ordained by God, indissoluble except by death. She would have known that her primary duty as a woman was to marry, bear children, and raise them in the Christian faith. And she would have learned about the secular world as well, the intricate web of alliances and feuds that connected noble families, the importance of honor and loyalty, the duties that bound lords to their followers and followers to their lords. In the violent, unstable world of 10th century England, survival often depended on having powerful allies and knowing who to trust. Young Ælfgifu, growing up in York in the 970s and early 980s, would have been keenly aware of the political tensions that surrounded her family. Her father Thored was a powerful lord, but his power rested on the support of the king in distant Wessex, and that support could be withdrawn if the king decided Thored was becoming too independent or too threatening. The king needed the loyalty of men like Thored to control the north, but he also feared them. Worried that they might rebel or ally with the king's enemies, these tensions would come to a head in the year 975, when King Edgar died. Edgar had been a strong king, respected and feared, capable of keeping the fractious English nobility in line. His death created a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for Ælfgifu's life. Edgar left 2 sons. The elder was Edward, a boy of about 12 or 13, whose mother's status was disputed. Some sources say she had been Edgar's wife, others that she was merely a concubine. The younger son was Æthelred, perhaps 10 years old, whose mother, Ælfrith, was undoubtedly Edgar's anointed queen. The question of which boy should inherit the throne split the English nobility into factions. Those who supported Edward included the archbishops of Canterbury and York and several powerful ealdormen. They argued that Edward was the elder son and should inherit by right of primogeniture. The oldest son inherits first. Those who supported Æthelred included his mother Ælfrith, the Bishop of Winchester, and other nobles. They argued that Æthelred's mother had been crowned queen, making him the legitimate heir, while Edward's mother had not been crowned. The dispute was not merely legal or dynastic. It reflected deeper divisions within English society, between those who supported the monastic reform movement that Ælfrith championed and those who opposed it, between those who had been close to Edgar and wanted to maintain his policies and those who wanted change, between powerful families competing for influence and land. Young Ælfgifu, perhaps 5 years old in 975, probably understood little of these great events, but her father Thored certainly did. The ealdorman of York had to choose which side to support, knowing that the wrong choice could cost him his position or even his life. The sources suggest that Thored backed Edward, for he continued to witness charters during the brief reign of Edward II. Edward's supporters prevailed, at least initially. The boy was crowned king at Kingston-upon-Thames in the spring of 975. But his reign was troubled from the start. Famine struck England, the crops failed, and people went hungry. Strange portents appeared in the sky, comets and eclipses that people interpreted as signs of God's displeasure. The political tensions that had surrounded Edward's succession never eased. And then, just 3 years after becoming king, Edward was murdered. On March 18, 978, the 15-year-old king rode to visit his stepmother Ælfrith and his half-brother Æthelred at Corfe in Dorset. According to later accounts, Edward was attacked by Æthelred's retainers as soon as he arrived. He was stabbed or struck. He managed to remount his horse and tried to flee, but he fell from the saddle and was dragged by his stirrup, dying of his wounds. His body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave at Wareham. No one was ever punished for Edward's murder. No investigation was conducted. Within weeks, young Æthelred, now perhaps 12 years old, was crowned King of England. The finger of suspicion pointed immediately at Ælfrith. Had the Queen Mother ordered her stepson's death to clear the path for her own son? Or had Æthelred's overzealous followers acted on their own initiative, thinking to please their lord by removing his rival? We will never know the truth, but what is certain is that Edward's murder cast a long shadow over Æthelred's reign. Many people believed that the young king had come to power through fratricide, through the murder of his own brother. This belief weakened Æthelred's authority and gave his enemies, both English nobles and foreign invaders, an excuse to oppose him. Within a few years, Edward's grave became a site of pilgrimage. Miracles were reported there. The dead king was venerated as a martyr, a saint killed by wicked men who wanted power. Edward the Martyr, people called him, and the cult of St. Edward the Martyr grew rapidly, spreading across England. For Æthelred, this was deeply troubling. Every miracle reported at Edward's tomb was an implicit accusation against Æthelred and his supporters. Every prayer offered to St. Edward was a reminder that Æthelred's throne rested on blood and betrayal. Young Ælfgifu, perhaps 8 years old when Edward was murdered, probably heard the rumours and whispers about the new king. Did she know then that she would one day marry him, that her life would be bound up with this troubled, controversial young man who had come to power under such terrible circumstances? Probably not. Children of 8 rarely think about marriage. Even children of the nobility who knew they would be married for political advantage. Ælfgifu was still a child, still learning her lessons, still playing games with other children in her father's household. The great events of the kingdom, royal murders, coronations, power struggles, must have seemed very distant from her daily life in York. But the years passed, and Ælfgifu grew. By the mid-980s, she would have been in her mid-teens, of marriageable age by the standards of her time. Her father Thored would have been thinking about her future, considering which marriage would most benefit his family. And King Æthelred, now approaching adulthood himself, was also thinking about marriage. The king needed to marry. He needed to produce heirs to secure the succession. He needed to forge political alliances that would strengthen his position. And he needed to demonstrate that he was a man, not a boy, capable of ruling in his own right, rather than being controlled by his mother and her advisors. Æthelred looked north, to York, to the household of Ealdorman Thored. He saw a powerful lord who controlled a crucial region, a man whose support was essential if the king was to rule effectively in Northumbria. And he saw Thored's daughter, Ælfgifu, a girl of about 15 or 16, of noble blood, suitable to be a queen. And so, sometime around 985 or 986, the exact date is lost to history, a marriage was arranged. Ælfgifu, daughter of Thored, would marry Æthelred, King of England. The alliance would bind the north to the south, would give Æthelred a foothold in that difficult region, would produce children who would have both West Saxon royal blood and northern noble blood. For Ælfgifu, this marriage meant leaving her home, leaving her family, leaving everything she knew, and travelling south to a world very different from the one she had grown up in. It meant becoming Queen of England, or at least becoming the king's wife, for as we shall see, the title of queen would be denied to her. Let us imagine Ælfgifu's final days in York before her marriage. Did she pack her belongings, gathering the clothes and jewellery and precious objects she would take with her to her new life? Did she say tearful farewells to her mother, to her siblings if she had any, to her childhood friends? Did she pray in York Minster one last time, asking God to guide her and protect her in the uncertain times ahead? We don't know. The sources don't tell us, but we can imagine. And in imagining, we can perhaps feel a little of what Ælfgifu must have felt. Excitement mixed with fear, hope mixed with sadness, anticipation of her new life mixed with grief at leaving her old one behind. And then she travelled south, this teenage girl from York, to meet her destiny in Wessex, to marry a king, to bear royal children, and to vanish into the shadows of history. Before we follow Ælfgifu to her wedding, let us take a moment to understand the man she was about to marry and the troubled kingdom he ruled. For Æthelred II, later known by the unfortunate epithet the Unready, was a complex figure, neither the complete incompetent that popular history has painted him, nor the misunderstood genius that some modern historians have tried to make him. He was, like most people, complicated, capable of both wisdom and folly, strength and weakness, courage and cowardice. Æthelred, was born around the year 966 to 968, the second son of King Edgar and his queen, Ælfthryth. His name in Old English was Æthelred, which breaks down into two elements, Ethel meaning noble, and red meaning counsel or advice. So his name meant something like noble counsel or well advised, a name full of hope and promise for a young prince. But history would twist that hopeful name into a bitter jest. Centuries after Æthelred's death, writers began calling him Æthelred Unread, a pun in Old English, where unread meant no counsel, or badly advised, or ill-counselled. The name Æthelred Unread was a play on words. His name meant noble counsel, but the epithet meant he was poorly counselled, or without good counsel. It was a cruel joke, turning his hopeful name into an insult. Later, as the Old English language evolved into Middle English and then into Modern English, and as people forgot what unread originally meant, the epithet was corrupted into unready, which gives English speakers the impression that Æthelred was somehow unprepared for kingship, that he wasn't ready to be king. But that's not what it originally meant at all. The original meaning was that he received bad advice, that his counselors were incompetent or treacherous, that he made poor decisions based on poor counsel. Whether this epithet was fair is a matter of considerable historical debate. Some historians argue that Æthelred was indeed a poor king, who made catastrophically bad decisions and presided over the collapse of Anglo-Saxon England. Others argue that he faced impossible challenges, renewed Viking invasions on a scale not seen in generations, internal treachery from his own nobles, the legacy of his brother's murder, and that any king would have struggled under such circumstances. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Æthelred made mistakes, serious mistakes that cost his kingdom dearly, but he also faced genuine difficulties that were not of his making and that he could not easily overcome. Let us look at the world Æthelred inherited when he became king in 978. England had enjoyed relative peace and prosperity for nearly a century. The great Viking invasions of the 9th century had been beaten back by Alfred the Great and his descendants. The Kingdom of England had been forged from the wreckage of those invasions, uniting for the first time the formerly separate kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria under one crown. The English economy had recovered from the devastation of war. Towns grew, trade flourished, churches and monasteries were built or rebuilt, learning and literature thrived. This prosperity was not universal, of course. The mass of people, the peasants who worked the land, lived lives of hard labor and limited horizons. But compared to the chaos of the Viking Age, the late 10th century seemed like a golden age, a time of peace and stability. But that stability depended on strong kingship. Kings like Alfred, Edward the Elder, Æthelstan, and Edgar had been formidable men, warriors, and politicians who commanded respect and obedience. When Æthelred became king at age 12, he was neither formidable nor respected. He was a child who had come to power through his brother's murder. His legitimacy was questionable. His ability to rule was untested. During Æthelred's minority, the years when he was too young to rule on his own, England was governed by regents, particularly his mother Ælfthryth and Archbishop Dunstan of Canterbury. These were experienced politicians who had served Æthelred's father and who understood how power worked in Anglo-Saxon England. They kept the kingdom running, maintained order, dealt with day-to-day governance. But when Æthelred reached his late teens and began to assert his own authority, he did something that would characterize his entire reign. He made enemies unnecessarily. In 984, when he was about 16 or 17, he expelled his mother from court, rejecting her counsel and her influence. He surrounded himself with new advisors, younger men who owed their positions to him rather than to his father or mother. This might seem like a reasonable move, a young king asserting his independence, rejecting the regents who had controlled him during his childhood. But it alienated Ælfthryth, who was one of the most powerful and experienced political operators in England. It also alienated those nobles and churchmen who had been close to Ælfthryth. Æthelred had made enemies of people who might have been his strongest supporters. He also began seizing church lands, granting them to his new favourites. This was politically foolish in a deeply Christian society where the church wielded enormous moral authority. Bishops and abbots protested. They accused the king of sacrilege, of robbing God himself. They said that England would suffer divine punishment for the king's crimes against the church. And then the Viking raids resumed. In 980, just 2 years after Æthelred became king, the first significant raid in a generation struck Southampton. It was not a massive invasion, just a few ships raiding a coastal town, but it was shocking. Vikings, the nightmare of the 9th century, was returning. More raids followed. In 981, Vikings attacked Cornwall. In 982, they struck Dorset and Devon. In 988, they raided Devon again. These were still relatively small-scale attacks, nothing like the great invasions of the past, but they were troubling. They suggested that word was spreading in Scandinavia that England was vulnerable again, that its king was weak, that plunder was available for those bold enough to sail across the North Sea and take it. This was the situation when Æthelred married Ælfgifu in the mid-980s. He was a young king, probably in his late teens, ruling a kingdom that was beginning to look unstable. He had alienated his mother and quarrelled with the church. Viking raids were increasing. He needed to shore up his position, and one way to do that was through a politically advantageous marriage. Ælfgifu's father Thored was one of the most powerful men in the realm. He controlled Northumbria, that troublesome northern region that had always been difficult for southern kings to manage. An alliance with Thored, sealed through marriage to his daughter, would help secure Æthelred's position in the north. It would give him a foothold in a region where the people still remembered the days of Viking rule and weren't entirely sure they wanted to be part of a southern-dominated kingdom. From Thored's perspective, marrying his daughter to the king was an enormous opportunity. His grandchildren would be royal princes and princesses. His family's status would be elevated. His influence at court would increase. It was the kind of match that ambitious nobles dreamed about. And for Ælfgifu, what did she think about marrying a king who was only a few years older than herself? A king whose reign was already troubled. A king who had come to power through his brother's murder. Did she have any choice in the matter? Almost certainly not. Marriages among the nobility in this period were political arrangements, not love matches. Daughters were married to forge alliances, to end feuds, to bind families together. Their personal feelings were rarely considered. So Ælfgifu travelled south to marry Æthelred. The sources don't tell us where the wedding took place or what it was like. We can assume it was held in one of the major royal centres, perhaps Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, or perhaps London, or perhaps Canterbury. There would have been a church ceremony, for Christian marriage had to be solemnized by a priest. There would have been feasting and celebration. Nobles from across England would have attended to witness the union and to curry favour with the king and his new bride. And then the marriage was consummated. This was an important step, for a marriage was not considered fully valid until it had been consummated. Witnesses might even have been present to confirm that the couple had indeed shared a bed, though this was becoming less common by the late 10th century. Ælfgifu was now the king's wife, but she was not the queen. and that distinction would define her entire life at court. When Ælfgifu arrived at the royal court as Æthelred's wife, probably in late 985 or early 986, she entered a world that must have seemed both magnificent and alien to a girl raised in the north. The royal court was itinerant. It didn't stay in one place, but moved from estate to estate throughout the year. This was partly for practical reasons. A medieval king owned estates scattered across his kingdom, and it was easier to move the court to where the food was than to transport vast quantities of food to one central location. It was also politically important for the king to show himself in different parts of the realm, to hold court and dispense justice, to remind his subjects that he existed and ruled them. So Ælfgifu's new life would be one of constant travel. She would spend a few weeks or months at Winchester, then move to London, then to one of the royal estates in the countryside, then back to Winchester or on to yet another location. This constant movement was exhausting, especially for a woman who would soon be frequently pregnant. The royal court itself was a large, complex organization. At its center was the king's household, his immediate family, his personal servants, his closest advisors. Surrounding this inner circle were larger numbers of nobles and their own retainers, clerks who kept records and wrote letters, priests who said daily masses, warriors who provided security, merchants who supplied goods, craftsmen who made everything from clothing to weapons, and a host of lesser servants who cooked and cleaned and carried and did the 1,000 tasks necessary to keep a medieval court functioning. Life at court revolved around ceremony and hierarchy. Everyone had their place, their rank, their role. Seating at meals, the order of processions, who spoke first in councils. All these things were carefully regulated according to complex rules of precedence. To violate these rules, to sit where you weren't supposed to sit or speak when you weren't supposed to speak, was not just rude. It was a challenge to the social order itself. Ælfgifu's position in this hierarchy should have been at the very top. She was the king's wife. She should have been the hlefdig, the lady, the queen. She should have been crowned and anointed in a sacred ceremony that would set her above all other women and make her the king's partner in ruling the realm. But she was not. Ælfthryth, Æthelred's mother, had been crowned and anointed. She had been given the title of queen. She had signed royal charters alongside her husband. But Ælfgifu was simply called the king's wife. She never received a coronation. She never signed charters. Her name appears nowhere in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, that invaluable year-by-year record of English history compiled by monks in various monasteries. Why was Ælfgifu treated so differently from Ælfthryth? This question has puzzled historians for generations, and several theories have been proposed to explain it. One theory focuses on Ælfthryth herself. Æthelred's mother had been an enormously powerful woman, probably too powerful. Many people believed that she had ordered the murder of Edward the Martyr to clear the path for her own son to become king. Whether this was true or not, the suspicion was there, and it created a backlash against powerful queens. Perhaps Æthelred and his advisors decided that queens were dangerous, that giving them too much power invited catastrophe. Better to keep the king's wife powerless and silent than to risk creating another Ælfthryth. Another theory points to Ælfgifu's northern origins. The West Saxon nobility might have resented this northern woman, this daughter of an ealdorman, whose family had probably lived under Viking rule just a generation earlier. Perhaps they saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't deserve the honor of being crowned Queen of Wessex. Perhaps Æthelred, politically weak and dependent on the support of powerful southern nobles, simply didn't have the power to insist that his northern wife be crowned. A third theory suggests that Ælfgifu's lack of coronation reflected the uncertain state of queenship itself in late Anglo-Saxon England. The role and status of queens had varied enormously over the centuries. Some queens had been powerful, others had been non-entities. There was no single consistent tradition of queenship that everyone agreed on. Perhaps Æthelred simply chose not to crown his wife because he didn't feel it was necessary. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Ælfgifu was queen in private, but a nobody in public. She shared the king's bed, bore his children, managed his household when he was away. But she had no formal status, no public role, no voice in governance. She existed in the shadows, unseen and unheard. We can imagine how frustrating this must have been for her. Her father was one of the most powerful men in England. She herself was married to the king, but she was treated as if she were nobody special, as if her marriage meant nothing beyond the production of heirs. And yet, despite her lack of official status, there is evidence that some people did recognize Ælfgifu as the lady and treated her with respect. Those two Anglo-Saxon wills we mentioned earlier are precious evidence of this. The first will, dating from between 975, 980 and 987, was made by a thegn named Beorhtric and his wife. In it, they bequeathed to their lady, Ælfdig, an armlet worth 30 gold mancuses and a stallion. Let us pause and consider what this gift meant. 30 mancuses of gold was a substantial sum, perhaps 6 months' income for a prosperous peasant family, enough to buy several cows or a decent-sized plot of land. The armlet would have been a beautiful piece of jewelry, probably made by skilled craftsmen, possibly decorated with intricate metalwork or even precious stones. The stallion would have been a valuable animal, carefully bred for strength and speed. These were not trivial gifts. They were the kinds of things you gave to someone important, someone you wanted to honor, someone whose favor you hoped to win or maintain. The fact that Beorhtric and his wife called Ælfgifu their lady and asked her to oversee the implementation of their will tells us that they saw her as having authority, as being someone who could ensure their wishes were respected after their deaths. The second will dates from later, between 990 and 1001, near the end of Ælfgifu's life. In this will, a noblewoman named Æthelgifu, a different person, though they shared the same name, promised a bequest of 30 mancuses of gold to my lady, Maire Hlefdian. Again, a substantial gift, and again the use of the term my lady suggests respect and recognition of status. These wills are almost the only contemporary evidence we have of Ælfgifu's existence. They're precious because they show us that at least some people acknowledged her position and treated her with honor, even if the official records of the realm, the chronicles and charters, ignored her completely. What do we know about Ælfgifu's daily life during these years at court? Very little, unfortunately. She doesn't appear in any narratives, doesn't have any stories told about her, doesn't feature in any anecdotes. She's just absent. But we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about how royal women lived in this period. Ælfgifu would have had her own household within the larger royal household. She would have had servants who attended to her personal needs, women who helped her dress, who arranged her hair, who kept her chambers clean, who prepared her meals. She would have had a bower, a private chamber where she could retreat from the public life of the court. The bower was the domain of women, a space where men rarely entered, where women could talk and laugh and work without male supervision. In her bower, Ælfgifu would have spent her time in traditional women's work. She and her ladies would have spun wool and woven cloth. This was not just make work to keep idle hands busy. Cloth production was one of the most important economic activities in medieval England, and even royal women participated in it. The cloth produced in the Queen's bower would have been of the highest quality. perhaps intended as gifts for important guests or for making the finest garments for the royal family. They would have done embroidery as well, creating beautiful decorated textiles. Anglo-Saxon embroidery was famous throughout Europe for its quality. Wealthy people across the continent paid high prices for English embroidered goods. The most skilled embroiderers might spend months or even years on a single piece, creating intricate designs of incredible complexity and beauty. Ælfgifu would have also been responsible for managing the household stores. She would have overseen the distribution of food and drink, ensured that servants were doing their jobs properly, kept track of supplies of everything from grain to candles. This was serious work that required organizational skill and constant attention. A royal household consumed enormous quantities of food and supplies, and keeping everything running smoothly was a major undertaking. When the court moved from place to place, Ælfgifu would have been responsible for organizing the packing and transport of her own household goods, and probably for overseeing much of the logistics of the move. This was no small task. A royal court on the move was like a small army, with hundreds of people and carts full of supplies all needing to be coordinated. But beyond these household duties, Ælfgifu seems to have had no public role at all. She didn't witness charters, which means she wasn't present at formal royal councils, or at least wasn't considered important enough to have her name recorded. She didn't make grants of land or privilege, which means she didn't control significant resources of her own. She didn't have any recorded interaction with the church, no foundations of monasteries or convents, no famous acts of charity that found their way into chronicles. She was invisible, and into this invisible life she bore many children. Now let us turn our attention to the one duty that Ælfgifu fulfilled magnificently, the one role in which she succeeded beyond question. She bore children. Between the mid-980s and the early 1000s, Ælfgifu gave birth to at least 6 sons and several daughters, filling the royal nursery with healthy children and securing the succession for Æthelred's line. This was, in many ways, the most important thing a queen could do in the medieval world. Kings needed heirs, multiple heirs preferably, because infant and child mortality was so high that even royal children often died before reaching adulthood. A queen who produced many healthy sons was doing her most essential duty, the duty for which she had been married in the first place. Let us consider for a moment what pregnancy and childbirth meant in the 10th century, for this will help us understand what Ælfgifu endured repeatedly throughout her marriage. Pregnancy in the medieval world was a time of great anxiety. There were no pregnancy tests, no ultrasounds, no reliable way to know for certain that a woman was pregnant until she began to show, or until she felt the baby move within her womb, usually around the 4th or 5th month. Some women suspected they were pregnant when their monthly courses stopped, but this was not always reliable, as stress and illness could also cause missed periods. Once a pregnancy was confirmed, the mother-to-be would begin to prepare for the ordeal ahead. She knew that childbirth was dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous thing she would ever do. Every woman knew someone who had died in childbirth: a mother, a sister, a friend, a neighbor. Death in childbirth was so common that it was accepted as one of the normal risks of being a woman. The church taught that pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. When God cursed Eve after she ate the forbidden fruit, he said, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." Medieval Christians believed this curse applied to all women for all time. The pain of childbirth was your punishment for being female, for being a daughter of Eve. As her pregnancy advanced, a noble woman like Ælfgifu would begin to withdraw from public life. In the final weeks before birth, she would enter a period of confinement, staying in her private chambers attended only by women. Men, including her husband, were not supposed to enter these chambers during this time. Childbirth was women's business, a mystery that men were excluded from. When labor began, the birthing chamber would be prepared. Candles would be lit. Fires would be built to warm the room. Clean linens would be gathered, and the midwives would arrive, experienced women who had attended many births and who knew the techniques for easing the baby's passage into the world. The mother would labor for hours, sometimes for days. First-time mothers often labored longer than women who had given birth before. The pain would come in waves, contractions that grew stronger and closer together as labor progressed. The midwives would encourage the mother, would help her find positions that eased the pain, would massage her belly and give her herbal teas thought to speed delivery. If the labor went normally, eventually the baby would emerge. The midwife would cut the umbilical cord, tie it off, clean the baby, and present it to the mother. If it was a boy, there would be great rejoicing, for sons were more valuable than daughters in a world where inheritance followed the male line. If it was a girl, there would be less enthusiasm, though parents usually still welcomed daughters. But labor did not always go normally. Sometimes the baby was positioned wrong, feet first instead of head first, or sideways, or with the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck. Sometimes the baby was too large to pass through the birth canal. Sometimes the mother hemorrhaged, bleeding uncontrollably. Sometimes infections set in after birth, causing fever and eventually death. Medieval midwives had some techniques for dealing with complications. They could try to turn a baby that was positioned wrong. They could administer herbs to stop bleeding or to fight infection. But they had no surgical tools, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no cesarean sections. When complications became severe, all they could do was pray and hope that God would spare the mother and child. Ælfgifu survived childbirth at least 6 times that we know of, and probably more, for we only know about the children who survived to be recorded in historical documents. She may have had other pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, or children who died in infancy before anyone bothered to record their names. Each time she became pregnant, she must have faced the possibility that she might die. Each time she went into labor, she must have wondered if she would survive to see her baby grow up. And between pregnancies, she would have been recovering. The human body needs time to heal after childbirth. Medieval women were supposed to undergo a period of lying in after giving birth, staying in bed for several weeks to recover their strength. Then there was the churching ceremony, a religious ritual where women who had given birth were purified and welcomed back to church. Only after churching was a woman supposed to resume normal activities, including sexual relations with her husband. But the spacing of Ælfgifu's children suggests that she became pregnant again, quite quickly after each birth. Her eldest 4 sons, Æthelstan, Ecgbert, Æthelred, and Edmund, first appeared together in the historical record in 993, suggesting they were close in age, probably born within a few years of each other in the late 980s. The younger 2 sons, Edwig and Edgar, appear later, in 997 and 1001 respectively, suggesting they were born in the mid to late 990s. This pattern of frequent pregnancies was typical for royal women. Kings needed heirs, and they needed them quickly. The death rate among children was so high that having only 1 or 2 sons was risky. They might die before reaching adulthood. Having 6 sons, as Ælfgifu did, was much safer. Even if some died young, others would survive to carry on the line. Let us now speak of these children individually, for each of them had their own story, their own fate, their own place in the turbulent history of early 11th century England. The eldest son was Æthelstan Ætheling. The name Æthelstan was a powerful one in the West Saxon royal line. King Æthelstan, who ruled from 924 to 939, had been the first king to rule all of England, the first to conquer Northumbria and unite the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one crown. He had been a warrior king, a conqueror, a powerful ruler who commanded respect. Naming Æthelred's eldest son after this illustrious predecessor was a way of connecting the baby to his glorious heritage, of suggesting that this new Æthelstan might also be a great king someday. Little Æthelstan was probably born in 986 or 987, within the first year or two of his parents' marriage. As the king's eldest son, he was heir apparent to the throne of England. From the moment of his birth, his life had purpose and direction. He would be raised to be king. He would learn the arts of warfare and governance. He would be groomed to take his father's place when the time came. Æthelstan first appears in the historical record in 993, when he was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, witnessing a royal charter alongside his father and his younger brothers. This early appearance in official documents tells us that Æthelstan was being prepared for his future role. He was attending royal councils, even as a child, learning by observation how the business of government was conducted. As he grew older, Æthelstan accumulated lands and wealth. By the time he was a young man, he held extensive estates, particularly in southeastern England. He was involved in governance and diplomacy. He was trusted by his father and relied upon. Everything suggested that when Æthelred eventually died, Æthelstan would smoothly succeed him as King Æthelstan II. But fate had other plans. In June of 1014, when Æthelstan was probably in his late 20s, he died. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records his death with characteristic brevity. And Æthelstan, the king's son, died. That's all. No explanation of how he died, no description of his illness or injury, no funeral, no expressions of grief. Just the bare fact of his death. The timing of Æthelstan's death was particularly unfortunate. The year 1014 was one of intense crisis. Just a few months earlier, Swine Forkbeard of Denmark had conquered all of England, forcing Æthelred to flee into exile in Normandy. Then Swine had died suddenly in February 1014, and Æthelred had been invited back to reclaim his throne. But Swine's son Canute was still in England with a Danish army, and the English were mobilizing to fight him. In the midst of this crisis, the king's eldest son and heir apparent died. It was a devastating blow. Æthelred had lost not just a son, but his designated successor, the man who was supposed to continue his line and rule England after him. The succession, which had seemed secure with multiple sons to choose from, suddenly became more uncertain. Before his death, Æthelstan had written a will that has survived to the present day, and it gives us a rare, intimate glimpse into the life of one of Ælfgifu's sons. In the will, written in Old English, Æthelstan bequeathed his possessions to various people. He left lands to his father, the king. He left money to monasteries for prayers for his soul. He left personal possessions to friends and followers. But 2 items in the will are particularly poignant. First, Æthelstan mentions his grandmother, Ælfthryth, Æthelred's mother, suggesting that he had been close to her. He may have been raised partly by her, as was common for royal children to be fostered by their grandparents. Second, he leaves his most precious possession, the sword of King Offa of Mercia, a legendary weapon hundreds of years old, to his younger brother Edmund. This gift of the sword to Edmund is touching and significant. It suggests that Æthelstan knew he was dying and wanted to pass this symbol of royal power to the brother who would likely succeed where he could not. The sword of Offa was not just any weapon. It was a relic, an ancient blade that carried with it centuries of history and prestige. By giving it to Edmund, Æthelstan was symbolically passing on his role as leader of his generation. as the one who would defend England and the royal line. And Edmund would need that sword, for after Æthelstan's death, the burden of leadership fell to him, and he would face challenges that would have tested any man. But before we speak of Edmund, let us mention the other brothers, those whose stories are briefer and sadder than Æthelstan's. The second son was Ecgbert Ætheling, named after yet another illustrious West Saxon king. Ecgbert, who ruled Wessex from 802 to 839, had been the first of the West Saxon kings to establish dominance over the other English kingdoms. He had conquered Kent and defeated the Mercians, and begun the process of West Saxon expansion that would eventually lead to a united England. Naming a son after Ecgbert was thus another way of connecting the child to his royal heritage. But unlike his namesake, young Ecgbert would never accomplish anything notable. He appears in a few charters in the 990s, witnessing documents alongside his father and brothers, and then he disappears from the historical record, probably dying sometime around 1005 or 1006. We know nothing about how he died or where he was buried. He was simply there 1 year and gone the next, leaving no trace beyond his name on a few documents. The same is true of the third son, Æthelred Ætheling. Æthelred was named after King Æthelred, who ruled from 946 to 955, another capable warrior king who had maintained English dominance over Northumbria during a difficult period. But young Æthelred, like Ecgbert, left almost no mark on history. He appears in documents from 993 onward, and then he vanishes, probably dying young like so many of his generation. These early deaths, Æthelstan, Ecgbert, Æthelred, all gone by the mid-1010s, remind us how precarious life was in the medieval world. These were royal princes, sons of the king, with access to the best food and shelter available. They were not going hungry. They were not living in squalid conditions. They were not doing dangerous manual labor. And yet, they died young anyway, victims of diseases we can no longer identify. Illnesses that today would be easily cured with antibiotics, but which in their time were death sentences. The fourth son was Edmund, and his story we have already touched upon, but it deserves to be told in fuller detail, for Edmund was the most famous and most successful of all Ælfgifu's children. Edmund was probably born around 990, making him about 12 years old when his mother died. As the fourth son, he would not originally have expected to become king. 3 older brothers stood ahead of him in line, but as those brothers died, Edmund moved up the succession, and by 1016, with Æthelstan and Ecgbert dead and Æthelred disappeared, Edmund had become the eldest surviving son, the heir apparent. Edmund seems to have inherited none of his father's indecisiveness. Where Æthelred hesitated, Edmund acted. Where Æthelred compromised, Edmund fought. Where Æthelred sought to appease his enemies, Edmund sought to destroy them. Edmund was everything his father was not: bold, decisive, courageous, aggressive. He was the kind of son every king dreamed of having, the kind of warrior prince who could defend the realm and continue the dynasty. But Edmund was also, in some ways, too bold, too aggressive. In 1015, while his father still lived and still ruled, Edmund rebelled. The immediate cause was Æthelred's order to execute 2 powerful northern nobles, Sigurfurth and Morcar, on suspicion of treason. Sigurfurth's widow, a woman named Eldgith, was imprisoned in a convent at Malmesbury. Edmund was outraged by this action. Perhaps he thought the executions were unjust. Perhaps he had political connections to Sigurfurth and Morcar and their followers. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to build his own power base independent of his failing father. Whatever his motives, Edmund rode to Malmesbury with armed men, broke Eldgith out of the convent, and married her without his father's permission. This was rebellion. a direct challenge to royal authority. By marrying Sigurð's widow without permission, Edmund was claiming Sigurð's lands and followers for himself. He was establishing himself as an independent power in the North and Midlands, a rival to his own father. The kingdom now had two leaders, the old king in the south and his rebellious son in the north. And this division weakened England at the worst possible moment, just as Knut's Danish army was preparing a major invasion. Some historians have viewed Edmund's rebellion as disloyal and destabilizing, an act that hastened England's collapse. Others have seen it as necessary. Æthelred was clearly failing as a king, and England needed stronger leadership. Edmund, by establishing himself as an alternative leader, may have been trying to save the kingdom that his father was losing. Whatever we think of Edmund's rebellion, it demonstrated his character. He was willing to defy his father, to break social conventions, to risk everything to pursue what he believed was right. He was a man of action, not of caution. And when he became king in 1016, after his father's death, he would prove just how formidable a warrior and leader he could be. We have already recounted, in our earlier section, how Edmund fought 5 battles against Knut in the summer of 1016, how he earned his nickname Ironside through his courage and determination, how he was betrayed at the Battle of Asandun by Edric Streona, how he made peace with Knut and divided the kingdom between them, and how he died mysteriously just 6 weeks later. Edmund's death was a tragedy not just for his family, but for all of Anglo-Saxon England. He had been the last real hope for English independence. His death left Knut as the undisputed master of England. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had existed for more than a century, united under one crown, was now part of a Danish empire. Edmund left behind 2 infant sons, Edward and the younger Edmund, who were sent away with orders to kill them, but were secretly saved and sent to Hungary. Through these sons, especially the elder Edward, known as Edward the Exile, Ælfgifu's bloodline would survive and eventually return to the English throne centuries later. The 5th son was Edwig Ætheling, about whom we know very little. Edwig first appears in documents in 997, suggesting he was born in the early to mid-990s. He was thus perhaps 10 years old when his mother died. After Knut conquered England in 1016, Edwig became a target for elimination. The new Danish king did not want any surviving sons of Æthelred, who might serve as rallying points for English resistance. Edwig was hunted down and killed, probably in 1017. He had committed no crime, posed no threat, but he was Æthelred's son, and that was enough. He had to die. The 6th and youngest son was Edgar Ætheling, who first appears in documents in 1001. He was thus probably born in the very late 990s, or around 1000, making him just a toddler when his mother died in 1002. Edgar simply disappears from the historical record after 1001. We don't know if he died young, was sent to a monastery, fled into exile, or met some other fate. He was there briefly, in the records, and then he was gone, lost to history, like so many of his brothers. 6 sons. Only one, Edmund Ironside, lived long enough to achieve anything notable, and he died at 26 after reigning for just 7 months. The others died young or disappeared, their potential unfulfilled, their stories untold. It's a sad catalogue of wasted lives, of children who might have done great things, but who were cut down by disease or violence or the simple misfortune of being born in a turbulent time. And then there were the daughters. In medieval sources, daughters were usually mentioned even less frequently than sons, and Ælfgifu's daughters are no exception. We know the names of a few of them, but even basic facts about their lives are scarce. One daughter was named Eadgith, and she made an important but ultimately tragic marriage. Eadgith married Edric Streona, who became Ealdorman of Mercia and one of the most powerful men in England. Edric was also one of the most notorious traitors in English history. His name, Streona, is thought to mean the grasper or the acquisitor, suggesting that contemporaries saw him as greedy and ambitious. Edric began his career as a loyal servant of Æthelred, rising through the ranks to become Ealdorman of Mercia, the Midlands region that was one of the richest and most powerful parts of England. His marriage to the king's daughter cemented his position and gave him even more prestige and influence. But Edric was loyal only to himself. Over the years, he repeatedly changed sides, supporting whoever he thought would win, betraying allies when it suited him. Most infamously, Edric betrayed Edmund Ironside at the Battle of Issanden in 1016. Edmund had trusted him, had made him a key part of his army, had relied on him to hold part of the line against the Danes. But at the critical moment of the battle, when everything hung in the balance, Edric and his Mercian troops fled the field, leaving Edmund and his remaining forces to be slaughtered by Knut's army. After the battle, Edric went over to Knut's side, apparently believing that the Danish conqueror would reward him for his betrayal, and Knut did reward him for a while. Edric continued to serve as Ealdorman of Mercia under Danish rule, but in 1017, Knut had Edric executed. Some sources say Knut killed him because he didn't trust a man who had betrayed his previous lords. Other sources say Knut simply didn't need him anymore. Either way, Edric died, and his widow Ælfgifu, Ælfgifu's daughter, was left alone. What happened to Ælfgifu after her husband's execution? We don't know. She disappears from the historical record. Perhaps she remarried. Perhaps she retired to a convent, as many widows did. Perhaps she died soon after her husband. We simply don't know. Another daughter was also named Ælfgifu. Yes, confusingly, Ælfgifu had a daughter named Ælfgifu, which must have made family gatherings complicated. This younger Ælfgifu married Uhtred, who became Earl of Northumbria, ruling from the ancient fortress of Bamburgh in what is now Northumberland. Uhtred was a powerful northern lord, a warrior who spent his life fighting the Scots to the north and the Danes to the south and various rivals within Northumbria itself. He was also Ælfgifu's kinsman, for his territory was the same Northumbria that Ælfgifu's father Thored had governed a generation earlier. The marriage between Uhtred and the younger Ælfgifu was thus a way of maintaining family connections in the north, of binding the royal house to the powerful northern nobility. But Uhtred, like so many men of his generation, met a violent end. In 1016, Knut had him murdered. The Danish king was eliminating potential English leaders who might resist his rule, and Uhtred, as a powerful northern earl with connections to the old royal house, was too dangerous to leave alive. The younger Ælfgifu was widowed, and like her sister Ælfgifu, she disappears from the records after her husband's death. A third daughter, possibly named Wulfhild, may have married Ulfketil, Ealdorman of East Anglia. Ulfketil was known as Ulfketil Snilling, Ulfketil the Bold, for his courage in fighting the Danes. He won several battles against Viking raiders in the early 11th century and earned a reputation as one of the most effective English military commanders. But Ulfketil too died fighting, killed at the Battle of Issanden in 1016, while standing beside Edmund Ironside to the bitter end. There may have been other daughters as well, but if there were, their names and fates have been lost. The sources are maddeningly vague about Ælfgifu's daughters, mentioning them only in passing, if at all. Looking at the fates of Ælfgifu's children, the sons who died young or were killed, the daughters who were widowed when their powerful husbands were murdered or executed, we see a pattern of tragedy. These were children born into privilege, children of the king, heirs to one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in Europe. They should have lived long, prosperous lives, should have ruled territories and founded dynasties and left their own marks on history. Instead, they lived through one of the most catastrophic periods in English history, a time when the kingdom collapsed under Danish invasion, when nobles betrayed each other with alarming frequency, when violence and sudden death were constant threats. Most of Ælfgifu's children did not survive to old age. Most did not achieve great things. Most were simply swept away by the tide of violence that engulfed their world. And their mother, Ælfgifu, did not live to see most of this. She died in 1002, or early 1002, before the catastrophe truly began, before the St. Brice's Day massacre, before Sweyn Forkbeard's invasions, before Edmund's heroic resistance, before the Danish conquest. She bore these children, raised them through their early years, and then died, leaving them to face the storm without her. Did Ælfgifu worry about her children's futures? She must have. Even in the relative stability of the 980s and 990s, she would have known that royal children faced special dangers. They were valuable as marriage partners and political tools, but they were also potential threats to whoever held power. A king's son could always become a rallying point for rebels. A king's daughter's marriage could create powerful rival factions. As Ælfgifu lay dying, however she died, wherever she died, did she think about her children? Did she worry about what would become of them after she was gone? Did she pray for their safety and success? Did she beg her husband to protect them? We don't know. The sources don't tell us. Ælfgifu's thoughts and feelings, her hopes and fears, her last words and final prayers, all of that has been lost to the silence of 1,000 years. But we can imagine. And in imagining, we can perhaps honor her memory, acknowledging that she was a mother who loved her children, even if history forgot to record that love. While Ælfgifu was bearing and raising her children in the relative peace of the late 980s and 990s, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Viking raids that had begun small in 980 were growing larger and more frequent. The temporary peace that England had enjoyed for a generation was coming to an end, and the storm that was approaching would consume everything, kingdoms, kings and queens alike. Let us step back now and look at the larger picture, the context of violence and chaos in which Ælfgifu lived her final years. For while she personally may have been insulated from the worst of the violence, staying safe in royal residences while warriors fought and died in distant battles, the threat was always there, always growing, always getting closer. The Viking Age, that period of Scandinavian expansion and raids that began in the late 8th century, had never really ended. The great invasions of the 9th century, when the Vikings conquered 3/4 of England, had been turned back by Alfred the Great and his descendants. The Danish armies had been defeated or absorbed into the English population. The Viking kingdoms of York and East Anglia had been conquered by the West Saxon kings. By the mid-10th century, it seemed like the Viking threat had been contained, like England was finally safe. But safety was an illusion. Across the North Sea, in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, new generations were growing up hearing stories of the wealth of England, the easy plunder to be had there, the glory that awaited warriors brave enough to sail west and take what they wanted. These young men wanted their own chance at fame and fortune. They wanted to prove themselves as their grandfathers had done, and they looked toward England with hungry eyes. The first raids of Æthelred's reign were small, a few ships attacking a coastal town, stealing what they could carry, killing or capturing anyone who resisted, and then sailing away before local forces could respond. These raids were annoying but not threatening to the stability of the kingdom. They killed hundreds of people, perhaps, but England had millions. They stole thousands of pounds of silver and goods, but England's economy was strong enough to absorb such losses. But the raids kept coming, and they kept getting bigger. By the early 990s, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. These were no longer just opportunistic attacks by small groups of raiders. These were organized military expeditions led by ambitious warlords who saw England as a target for conquest, not just for plunder. The key figures in this renewed Viking offensive were two men whose names would be forever linked to England's suffering: Olaf Tryggvason and Swine Forkbeard. Olaf Tryggvason was a Norwegian, a warrior of royal blood, who had spent years raiding across the Baltic and the British Isles. He was ambitious, capable, ruthless. He wanted to become king of Norway, but to do that, he needed wealth and followers, and the best way to get both was through successful raids on rich targets like England. In 991, Olaf arrived in England with a fleet of 93 ships, a massive force by the standards of the time. Each ship carried perhaps 50 to 100 warriors, which means Olaf's army numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. Olaf's fleet landed on the coast of Essex, near the town of Malden. The Vikings burned Ipswich, a prosperous trading town, and then moved toward London. The ealdorman of Essex, a man named Byrhtnoth, who was old enough to be a grandfather but still vigorous and brave, assembled an English army to confront them. The two armies met at Malden, where a narrow causeway connected the mainland to an island in the Blackwater estuary. The Vikings were on the island. The English held the causeway. If Byrhtnoth had simply held his position, the Vikings would have been trapped on the island, unable to get past the English forces blocking the causeway. But Byrhtnoth did something that has puzzled and troubled historians for 1,000 years. He allowed the Vikings to cross the causeway and form up their battle line on the mainland. Why? Some historians think he was foolishly chivalrous, wanting to give the enemy a fair fight rather than cutting them down as they crossed the narrow causeway where they couldn't defend themselves effectively. Others think he was overconfident, believing his English forces could easily defeat the Vikings in open battle and wanting to prove it. Still others think he may have been worried about the political consequences of a cautious victory, that he would be accused of cowardice if he didn't fight the Vikings fairly. Whatever his reasons, Byrhtnoth's decision was disastrous. Once the Vikings were across the causeway and formed up, the battle became a grinding match between two shield walls. A shield wall was the standard battle formation of the early medieval period. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears and swords bristling forward, each man protecting himself and the man next to him. The two shield walls would advance toward each other and then crash together, and then it became a matter of brute force and endurance, men hacking at each other with swords and axes, the front ranks falling and being replaced by those behind, until one side broke and fled. The Battle of Malden raged for hours. Men died by the hundreds. Blood soaked the ground. The crash of weapons on shields, the screams of the wounded, the battle cries of warriors, all of it created a terrifying cacophony, a hellish noise that could be heard for miles. And then Byrhtnoth fell. He was cut down in the thick of the fighting, dying bravely, but dying nonetheless. Some of his men saw him fall and fled, thinking the battle lost. But others, the best and bravest, chose to stay and die fighting rather than abandon their lord's body. They formed a circle around Byrhtnoth's corpse and fought on until they too were killed. The Vikings won. The English army was destroyed. Byrhtnoth's body was found on the battlefield, decapitated. His head had been taken as a trophy by the victorious raiders. The Battle of Malden was commemorated in one of the finest Old English poems, a work called simply The Battle of Malden. which celebrates the courage of Byrhtnoth and his men even in defeat. The poem became famous, memorized and recited for generations, a testament to English bravery even though they lost. But the immediate consequence of the battle was not poetic glory. It was humiliation and terror. The Vikings had destroyed an English army. They had killed one of the king's most important ealdormen, and they had proven that England could not defend itself. Æthelred faced a terrible choice. He could assemble more armies and continue fighting, risking more defeats and more devastation. Or he could do something that no English king had done in living memory. He could pay the Vikings to go away. He chose to pay. In exchange for a promise that they would leave England, Æthelred gave Olaf Tryggvason 10,000 pounds of silver. 10,000 pounds. To put this in perspective, the entire annual income of the English crown at this time was probably around 20,000 to 30,000 pounds. Æthelred was paying half a year's royal income to buy off one Viking army. The payment was called tribute by contemporaries, and later generations would call it Danegeld, Danish gold. It was a humiliation, an admission that England couldn't defend itself, that its king would rather pay bribes than fight. But from Æthelred's perspective, it probably seemed like a reasonable decision. 10,000 pounds was a lot of money, yes, but it was less than the cost of continued warfare. And it worked. Olaf took the money and sailed away. But Æthelred's decision had terrible consequences that he probably didn't foresee. Word spread throughout the Viking world that England was rich and weak, that its king would pay enormous sums rather than fight. Other Viking leaders heard this news and decided to try their own luck against the wealthy island kingdom. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason returned, this time with an even more formidable ally, Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Svein was one of the most powerful rulers in Scandinavia, a man who commanded vast resources and whose ambitions extended far beyond simple raiding. He wanted to build an empire, to conquer territories and rule them, to become one of the great kings of his age. Olaf and Svein joined forces and attacked England with a combined fleet of 94 ships. They besieged London but failed to capture the well-defended city. They ravaged the surrounding countryside, burning towns and villages, taking captives and plunder. They seemed unstoppable. Once again, Æthelred resorted to paying tribute. This time the payment was even larger, 16,000 pounds of silver. 16,000 pounds. The king was bankrupting his own treasury to pay off foreign invaders, but the payments worked, at least temporarily. Olaf and Svein took the money and departed. Olaf sailed back to Norway, where he successfully made himself king and spent the rest of his life spreading Christianity through his kingdom with fire and sword. He never returned to England. Svein went back to Denmark, but he would return again and again until he finally conquered all of England and made himself king. For Ælfgifu, living through these years, the Viking raids must have been a constant source of anxiety. She was safe enough in the royal residences, which were well defended and which the Vikings rarely approached. But she would have heard the reports of raids, of towns burned, of people killed or enslaved. She would have known that her husband's kingdom was under siege, that English forces were being defeated repeatedly, that Æthelred was paying vast sums to buy temporary peace, and she would have worried about her children. What kind of kingdom were they inheriting? Would it even exist by the time they were old enough to rule? Her eldest sons were still children in the 990s, but they were growing up, and soon they would be expected to fight, to defend the realm, to face the same Viking warriors who had defeated and killed so many English nobles. The late 990s brought a temporary lull in the large-scale invasions. The massive fleets led by great warlords didn't come, but the smaller raids continued, and the atmosphere of fear and insecurity never lifted. People in coastal areas lived in constant dread of seeing Viking sails on the horizon. Farmers in vulnerable regions planted their crops wondering if they would survive to harvest them or if Vikings would burn their fields. Merchants wondered if their goods would be stolen, their ships captured, their travels interrupted by raiders. And at the royal court, Æthelred tried desperately to shore up his defences and strengthen his position. He built or rebuilt fortifications. He attempted to assemble a fleet of English warships to intercept Viking raiders at sea before they could land. He forged diplomatic alliances, seeking friends and allies who might help England resist the Danish threat. One of his most important diplomatic initiatives was directed at Normandy, that curious duchy across the English Channel that had been founded by Vikings a century earlier. The Normans, Northmen, literally, men from the north, were descendants of Danish and Norwegian raiders who had conquered parts of northern France in the early 10th century. They had gradually adopted French language and customs, converting to Christianity and intermarrying with the local French population. But they maintained some of their Viking heritage, and they had close connections to Denmark and Norway. For years, Norman dukes had allowed Viking fleets to use Norman ports as bases for raids on England. The raiders would sail from Denmark or Norway to Normandy, rest and resupply there, and then cross the Channel to attack England. After raiding English towns and taking plunder, they would return to Norman ports to rest again before sailing back to Scandinavia. This arrangement was extremely frustrating for the English, who saw Norman harbours as effectively being Viking bases. Æthelred wanted to end this arrangement. He wanted the Norman dukes to close their ports to Viking raiders, to deny them safe harbour, to force them to sail directly from Scandinavia to England, which would make the raids more difficult and dangerous. And the traditional way to seal such a diplomatic agreement was through a royal marriage. In Normandy, Duke Richard II had a sister named Emma, probably born around 984 or 985. She was young, beautiful, well-educated, and came from one of the most prestigious families in Northern Europe. Her family could trace its lineage back to Rollo, the legendary Viking warlord who had conquered Normandy a century earlier and who had been baptized as a Christian and recognized as Duke of Normandy by the King of France. A marriage between Æthelred and Emma would bind England and Normandy together in an alliance. It would close Norman ports to Viking raiders. It would strengthen Æthelred's international position. It would produce children who had both English royal blood and Norman ducal blood, creating the possibility of future alliances between the two realms. There was just one problem. Æthelred was already married. He had been married to Ælfgifu for 15 years. She had borne him at least 6 sons and several daughters. She was still alive, still his wife, still living at court. In the Christian world of medieval Europe, marriage was considered indissoluble. A man couldn't simply divorce his wife because he wanted to marry someone else. The church forbade it. Public opinion condemned it. Kings who tried to cast aside their wives faced rebellion and excommunication. For Æthelred to marry Emma, Ælfgifu had to die. And die she did, conveniently, right when Æthelred needed her to. Sometime in late 1001 or very early 1002, Ælfgifu passed away. We don't know how. We don't know where. We don't know who was with her when she died. We know only that she died, and that within weeks, perhaps within days, Æthelred married Emma of Normandy. The timing is suspicious. Some historians have speculated that Ælfgifu might have been murdered to clear the way for Æthelred's politically necessary marriage to Emma. Others argue that this is paranoid speculation with no evidence to support it, that Ælfgifu probably died in childbirth or of illness, and that her death, while convenient for Æthelred's plans, was natural. We will never know the truth. What we do know is that Ælfgifu's death was treated with complete indifference by those who recorded England's history. No chronicle mentions when she died. No document describes her funeral. No one recorded where she was buried. She simply vanished from the historical record as if she had never existed. And immediately, scandalously quickly, Æthelred remarried. In April of 1002, just weeks or perhaps days after Ælfgifu died, the king married Emma of Normandy in a grand ceremony at Winchester. The contrast between the two weddings could not have been more stark. When Æthelred married Ælfgifu in the mid-980s, the sources say nothing about it. We don't even know for certain where or when it happened. But when he married Emma, the chroniclers paid attention. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the date, April 1002. It notes that Emma was the daughter of Richard, Duke of Normandy. It mentions the political significance of the marriage. And unlike Ælfgifu, Emma was crowned and anointed as queen. She received the title that Ælfgifu had been denied. She was given estates and revenues that made her wealthy and powerful. Her name appears on royal charters alongside her husband's. She witnesses important documents. She has a public role, a voice, an identity. Emma became everything that Ælfgifu had not been allowed to be. And in becoming queen, Emma ensured that Ælfgifu would be forgotten, overshadowed, erased from memory. Now let us trace the most extraordinary part of Ælfgifu's story, the part that she never knew, the legacy that unfolded long after her death. For while Ælfgifu lived and died in obscurity, while she was denied recognition and honor in her lifetime, her blood flowed forward through the centuries and ultimately triumphed. Every king and queen of England from Henry I onward, every monarch who has sat on the English throne for the last 900 years, every member of the current British royal family, all of them are descended from Ælfgifu of York. She is their ancestor. Her blood runs in their veins. The forgotten queen became the mother of dynasties. Let us trace this remarkable lineage, following the thread of Ælfgifu's blood through the tumultuous centuries that followed her death. The chain begins with Edmund Ironside, Ælfgifu's fourth son, the warrior prince who fought so bravely against Cnut in 1016. When Edmund died mysteriously in November of that year, leaving behind 2 infant sons, those sons became targets for elimination. Cnut, the new king of England, did not want any surviving sons of Æthelred, who might serve as rallying points for English resistance. Cnut reportedly sent orders to have the 2 boys killed, but the man charged with carrying out this order, sources disagree on exactly who it was, but he may have been a Swedish or Danish nobleman, was either too squeamish to murder infants or was moved by mercy. Instead of killing Edmund's sons, he secretly sent them away. The 2 boys, Edward and the younger Edmund, both still in their infancy, were smuggled out of England and sent to Sweden. From Sweden, they were sent to Hungary, which at that time was emerging as a powerful Christian kingdom on the eastern frontier of Europe. King Stephen I of Hungary, himself a recent convert to Christianity, who was trying to establish his country as a major European power, welcomed the English exiles. The 2 boys, grandsons of a king, represented valuable political assets. They might someday be useful if circumstances in England changed and there was an opportunity to restore the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty. The older boy, Edward, grew up in Hungary at King Stephen's court. He received an excellent education, learning Hungarian and probably some Latin and German. He was trained in the military arts, learning to ride and fight as Hungarian noblemen did. He married a Hungarian noblewoman, whose name is recorded in sources as Agatha. We don't know much about her. but she was probably related to the Hungarian royal family or to some powerful noble house. Edward and Agatha had 3 children, a son named Edgar and 2 daughters named Margaret and Christina. These children grew up in Hungary, speaking Hungarian, following Hungarian customs, but always aware that they had English royal blood, that they were descendants of the ancient royal house of Wessex. Meanwhile, in England, the Danish conquest that seemed so permanent in the 1020s and 1030s was proving to be temporary. Cnut died in 1035. His empire, which had stretched from England to Norway, immediately began to fragment. His sons fought over the inheritance. Harold Harefoot became King of England in 1037, but he died in 1040. Harthacnut, Emma's son by Cnut, then ruled from 1040 to 1042, but he too died suddenly, possibly from a stroke suffered while drinking heavily at a wedding feast. With Harthacnut's death, the Danish line ended. England needed a king, and the only obvious candidate was Edward, Emma's son by Æthelred, the prince who had spent decades in exile in Normandy while Danes ruled his father's kingdom. The English nobles invited Edward to return from exile and take the throne. In 1042, Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, became King of England, restoring the old West Saxon dynasty that had seemed to be extinguished forever. Edward the Confessor ruled England for 24 years, from 1042 to 1066. He is remembered as a pious king, a man more interested in building churches and praying than in warfare and politics. He was married to Edith, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin, but the marriage produced no children. Whether this was because Edward was too pious to consummate the marriage, as later hagiographies claimed, or because of infertility on one side or the other, we don't know. But the result was that when Edward died in January 1066, he had no direct heir. The succession crisis that followed Edward's death led directly to the Norman conquest. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and brother of Edward's wife, was crowned king, but William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. William invaded England, defeated and killed Harold at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, and made himself King of England. The Norman conquest transformed England utterly, replacing the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman nobles, introducing Norman French language and customs, building castles and cathedrals in the Norman style. It was one of the great turning points in English history, but there was still one surviving member of the old Anglo-Saxon royal house, Edgar the Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, great-grandson of Ælfgifu of York. Edgar was the son of Edward the Exile, who had grown up in Hungary and who had been invited back to England in 1057 as Edward the Confessor's designated heir. But Edward the Exile died within months of returning to England, possibly murdered, possibly from illness brought on by the drastic change in climate and diet. He never became king. His son Edgar, born probably in Hungary around 1051, was brought up in England at the royal court. When Edward the Confessor died in 1066, some English nobles wanted to make the 15-year-old Edgar king. He was, after all, the closest male relative to the late king, the last surviving member of the House of Wessex, the legitimate heir by blood. He was briefly proclaimed king by some northern nobles after Harold's death at Hastings. But Edgar was just a boy. He had no army, no power base, no way to resist William the Conqueror. William marched on London, and Edgar's supporters melted away. The young Ætheling, the Old English word for a prince of royal blood, submitted to William and acknowledged him as king. For the next several years, Edgar lived in a strange limbo. He was too valuable to kill. His royal blood made him potentially useful as a figurehead for resistance movements, but too dangerous to set free. William kept him under loose supervision. watching him but not imprisoning him. Edgar made several attempts to rebel or to escape to Scotland or the continent, but none of them succeeded. He participated in a major northern rebellion in 1069, but it was crushed by William's forces. Edgar gradually faded into obscurity, living quietly, no longer a political factor. He went on crusade in 1102, an old man by then, trying perhaps to find meaning in fighting for God since his fight for his crown had failed decades earlier. He may have died on that crusade, or he may have returned and died quietly in England sometime around 1125. The sources are unclear. Edgar never became king. He never married. He had no children. The male line of Edmund Ironside ended with him. But there were still 2 women carrying Ælfgifu's blood, Edgar's sisters, Margaret and Christina. Christina became a nun, entering Romsey Abbey and living there quietly for the rest of her life. She had no children, but her sister Margaret would change the world. Margaret of Hungary, as she was sometimes called, though she had been born in England and was English by blood, even if she grew up in Hungary, was one of the most remarkable women of the 11th century. When William the Conqueror conquered England, Margaret and her family fled north to Scotland, seeking refuge at the court of King Malcolm III. Malcolm, known as Malcolm Canmore, from the Gaelic Tean Mór, meaning great head or great chief, was a warrior king who had spent years fighting to establish his authority over Scotland. He was rough, uneducated, illiterate even, a product of Scotland's violent frontier society. But he was also intelligent and ambitious, and he recognized an opportunity when he saw one. Margaret was beautiful, pious, educated, and, most importantly, she had royal blood. She was a descendant of the ancient West Saxon kings. If Malcolm married her, his children would have claims to the English throne. They would be legitimate heirs to the House of Wessex. This could be enormously valuable politically. Malcolm proposed marriage. Margaret, who was deeply religious and had been considering becoming a nun, like her sister Christina, initially resisted, but eventually she agreed, whether from duty or because she genuinely came to care for Malcolm, or simply because she had no better options. They married around 1070. The marriage of the rough Scottish warrior and the refined English princess seems like it shouldn't have worked, but all evidence suggests it did. Margaret civilized Malcolm's court, introducing English and continental customs, founding churches and monasteries, promoting learning and piety. Malcolm, who couldn't read, would kiss the books that Margaret prayed from because he knew they were important to her. He supported her religious foundations, giving her money and land for her projects. And Margaret bore Malcolm 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. These children carried both Malcolm's Scottish royal blood and Margaret's English royal blood. They were descendants of both the House of Alpin, that had ruled Scotland for centuries, and the House of Wessex, that had ruled England. They represented a potential unification of the 2 kingdoms. The eldest son was Edward, named after Edward the Confessor. He died young, killed fighting in Scotland's constant border wars with England. The second son was Edmund, named after Edmund Ironside, named after Ælfgifu's heroic son. Edmund also seems to have died without achieving much. The third son, Edgar, named after Margaret's brother, became King of Scotland briefly, but was overthrown and spent much of his life in exile. But the fourth son was named Alexander, and he would become Alexander I of Scotland, ruling from 1107 to 1124. And the fifth son was David, who would become David I of Scotland, ruling from 1124 to 1153, and transforming Scotland into a powerful, centralized kingdom, modelled on the Norman feudal system. The sixth son, also named Edmund, lived quietly and left no mark on history. But Alexander and David, these two brothers, grandsons of Margaret, great-great-great-grandsons of Ælfgifu of York, would be crucial figures in preserving and transmitting Ælfgifu's bloodline to future generations. Alexander I married Sibylla, an illegitimate daughter of Henry I of England. The marriage produced no children. When Alexander died in 1124, he was succeeded by his brother David. David I married Maud, heiress of Earl Waltheof of Northumbria, one of the richest estates in England. The marriage made David enormously wealthy and powerful, ruling not just Scotland, but substantial territories in northern England as well. David and Maud had several children, but the most important for our purposes was their son Henry, who would become Earl of Northumbria and Earl of Huntingdon, and who would be heir to the Scottish throne. But young Henry died in 1152, a year before his father. David died in 1153, heartbroken by his son's death. The Scottish throne passed to Henry's son, a boy named Malcolm, who became Malcolm IV of Scotland. Malcolm was only 11 years old when he became king. He ruled for only 12 years, dying at age 24, unmarried and childless. When Malcolm IV died in 1165, the throne passed to his younger brother William, who became William I of Scotland, known as William the Lion for the lion that appeared on his coat of arms. William ruled Scotland for 49 years, dying in 1214 at the age of 70. He married Ermengarde de Beaumont and had several children. But what matters for our story is that William's daughter Margaret married Hubert de Burgh, and their descendants eventually died out. However, William's son Alexander became Alexander II of Scotland, ruling from 1214 to 1249. Alexander II married twice. His first wife, Joan of England, bore him no children. His second wife, Marie de Coucy, bore him a son who became Alexander III. And Alexander III married Margaret of England, daughter of Henry III. Alexander III and Margaret had 3 children: Margaret, Alexander, and David. But tragedy struck the family repeatedly. Prince David died young. Prince Alexander died in 1284. Princess Margaret married King Eric II of Norway and died in childbirth in 1283, but not before giving birth to a daughter who was also named Margaret. This younger Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, was Alexander III's only surviving descendant when he died in 1286. She was just 3 years old, living in Norway with her father. The Scottish nobles acknowledged her as Queen of Scots, and arrangements were made for her to come to Scotland. But little Margaret never made it. In 1290, while sailing from Norway to Scotland, she died, either from seasickness or from some illness. She was 7 years old. With her death, the direct line of descent from Malcolm III and Margaret ended. Scotland was plunged into crisis. 13 different claimants came forward, each claiming to have the best right to the throne. The competition became known as the Great Cause, and it was ultimately decided by Edward III of England, who chose John Balliol as King of Scots in 1292. But let us step back now, because we have lost the thread of Ælfgifu's blood in all these Scottish kings and queens. How does Ælfgifu's lineage connect to the English throne? Through Margaret's daughters. Margaret and Malcolm III had 2 daughters, Edith and Mary. Mary married Eustace III, Count of Boulogne, and their descendants included various continental nobles. But Edith made the crucial marriage that would bring Ælfgifu's blood back to the English throne. In 1100, King Henry III of England, youngest son of William the Conqueror, found himself in need of a wife. His older brother William Rufus had died in a hunting accident, and Henry had seized the throne ahead of his older brother Robert Curthose. But Henry's claim was contested. Robert was preparing to invade England and claim the crown for himself. Henry needed to strengthen his position to win the support of the English people who still resented Norman rule. And Henry hit upon a brilliant strategy. He would marry an English princess, someone with blood from the old Anglo-Saxon royal house. This would unite the Norman and Saxon lines, would make his children acceptable to both the Norman nobility and the English people, would legitimize his rule in a way that conquest alone could not. The perfect candidate was Edith, daughter of Malcolm III and Margaret. She had impeccable royal blood. Through her mother she was descended from Edmund Ironside, from Æthelred the Unready, from Alfred the Great, from all the ancient kings of Wessex. Through her father she was descended from the Scottish royal line. She was pious, educated, beautiful, and politically valuable. There was just one problem. Edith had been raised in a convent and had taken vows as a nun. Could Henry marry a nun? The church said no. Marriage vows superseded religious vows. If Edith had genuinely become a nun, she couldn't marry anyone. But Edith claimed that she had never actually taken final vows, that she had worn the nun's veil only to protect herself from unwanted attention from rough Norman nobles, that she had always intended to leave the convent if a suitable marriage presented itself. An ecclesiastical council investigated the matter and ruled in Edith's favour. She was free to marry. And so, in November 1100, Henry III married Edith, who changed her name to Matilda or Maud upon marriage, probably because Edith sounded too Anglo-Saxon and Norman nobles might have mocked it. The marriage united the Norman and English royal lines. Any children of Henry and Matilda would be able to claim descent from both William the Conqueror and the ancient West Saxon kings. Henry and Matilda had 2 children who survived to adulthood, a daughter named Matilda and a son named William. Young William was made heir to the throne, the designated future king, who would continue his father's line. But in November 1120, William drowned in a shipwreck when the White Ship sank while crossing the English Channel. Henry was left with only his daughter Matilda as his legitimate heir. In the medieval world, the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was controversial and problematic. Most people believed that women shouldn't rule, that kingdoms needed male leadership, that a queen regnant was against the natural order. But Henry had no other legitimate heirs. He forced his barons to swear oaths recognizing Matilda as his heir. Matilda married Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. Geoffrey came from the powerful Angevin dynasty that ruled Anjou, a territory in western France. He was nicknamed Geoffrey Plantagenet because he wore a sprig of flowering broom, planta genista in Latin, in his hat. This nickname would later become the name of the dynasty his descendants founded, the Plantagenets. Matilda and Geoffrey had 3 sons. The eldest was Henry, born in 1133. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda expected to become queen, as her father had intended. But her cousin Stephen of Blois, moving quickly while Matilda was in France, seized the English throne. What followed was a period known as the Anarchy, 19 years of civil war as Matilda and Stephen fought for control of England. Matilda invaded England and fought for her claim. She briefly captured Stephen and controlled much of the country, but she was never able to establish her rule securely, and eventually the war ground to a stalemate. In 1153, Stephen and Matilda agreed to a compromise. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but when he died, Matilda's son Henry would inherit the throne. Stephen died in 1154, and Matilda's son became Henry II, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. And Henry II was descended from Ælfgifu of York, through his mother Matilda, through Matilda's mother, also called Matilda Church Edith, through Margaret of Scotland, through Edward the Exile, through Edmund Ironside. Henry carried Ælfgifu's blood. Every English king and queen from Henry II onward has been descended from Ælfgifu. Henry II's son, Richard the Lionheart, descended from Ælfgifu. Richard's brother John, famous for signing the Magna Carta, descended from Ælfgifu. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, descended from Ælfgifu. Edward III, who claimed the French throne and started the 100 Years' War, descended from Ælfgifu. The Plantagenets gave way to the Lancastrians and Yorkists, who fought the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. All of them, every Lancastrian king, every Yorkist king, were descended from Ælfgifu. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485 and became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty, he too carried Ælfgifu's blood. The Tudors, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary the, Elizabeth the, all descended from Ælfgifu. When Elizabeth died without children in 1603, and the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the English and Scottish crowns, James carried Ælfgifu's blood through multiple lines. The Stuarts, the Hanoverians, Queen Victoria, Edward VII, George V, George VI, Elizabeth II, all descended from Ælfgifu of York. Prince William and Prince Harry, Princes George and Louis, Princesses Charlotte and Anne, all descended from Ælfgifu. Every person currently in line to the British throne carries the blood of the forgotten queen. Every British monarch for 900 years has been her descendant. The woman who was denied a crown in life became the ancestral mother of every monarch who wore that crown after Henry I, and not just British monarchs. Through intermarriage, Ælfgifu's descendants spread across European royal houses. Most current European royalty, the kings and queens of Spain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, all carry Ælfgifu's blood. She is one of the most common ancestors of European royalty. Her genes dispersed across the continent and beyond. This is the supreme irony of Ælfgifu's story. Emma of Normandy, the crown queen, the powerful queen, the queen who shaped events and commissioned histories. Emma's line died out. Her son Edward the Confessor had no children. Her son by Cnut, Harthacnut, had no children. Emma's genes, despite her success and power, vanished from history. But Ælfgifu, the uncrowned queen, the powerless queen, the queen who died forgotten, her genes survived and thrived and spread across the world. Every attempt to erase her, to forget her, to write her out of history failed ultimately because her blood kept flowing forward through the centuries, passing from generation to generation, ensuring that she would never be truly forgotten. So who was the more successful queen? Emma, who wielded power and shaped events, but whose line ended? Or Ælfgifu, who had no power and was forgotten, but whose line endured? History's answer is clear. In the game of dynasties, in the ultimate competition that medieval rulers cared about most, producing descendants who would carry on your line, Ælfgifu won. She won completely, decisively, permanently. She is the mother of kings, the ancestral queen, the forgotten woman who became the most important ancestor in English royal history. And perhaps, if there is any justice in the universe, this knowledge can serve as a kind of posthumous vindication for Ælfgifu. She was denied recognition in life. She was erased from history for 1,000 years. But she triumphed in the end, in the way that mattered most, through the survival and success of her descendants. The forgotten queen was never truly forgotten. Her blood remembered even when the chronicles did not. Dear listener, we have reached the final part of our journey through Ælfgifu's life and legacy. We have traced her story from birth to death, from obscurity to erasure, from forgotten queen to ancestral mother of dynasties. But before we conclude, let us ask one final question. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care about a woman who died more than 1,000 years ago? Why should we spend hours learning about someone who was so thoroughly forgotten that we don't even know when or how she died? What does Ælfgifu's story tell us that makes it worth remembering? The answer to these questions is multi-layered and profound. Ælfgifu's story matters for many reasons: historical, feminist, human. And each reason illuminates something important about our past and our present. First, and most obviously, Ælfgifu's story matters because it is true. She existed. She lived. She was a real human being with thoughts and feelings, hopes and fears, joys and sorrows. For 1,000 years, history forgot her, but that doesn't mean she never existed. Recovering her story is an act of historical justice, an acknowledgement that every person's life has value and meaning, even if they left no monuments or chronicles behind. History is often told as the story of great men, kings and warriors, conquerors and statesmen. Women appear in this narrative only as appendages to powerful men, as wives and mothers whose importance derives entirely from their relationships with fathers and husbands and sons. And even then, only some women appear, the exceptional ones, the ones who wielded power, the ones who left records of their actions. But for every Emma of Normandy who commanded armies and commissioned histories, there were dozens of women like Ælfgifu, women who lived in the shadows, who had no power, who were forgotten as soon as they died. These women were just as real, just as human, just as deserving of remembrance as the famous ones. Telling Ælfgifu's story is a way of acknowledging all the forgotten women of history, all the silenced voices, all the lives that mattered but left no trace. Second, Ælfgifu's story reveals the mechanisms of historical erasure. It shows us how power works, how some people get remembered and others get forgotten, how historical narratives are constructed by those with the power to write them. Ælfgifu was forgotten because no one powerful had an interest in remembering her. The chroniclers who wrote England's histories were monks and clerics who cared about kings and bishops and great political events. A queen who never wielded power, who never signed charters, who never did anything publicly notable. Such a queen was of no interest to them. Æthelred had no interest in remembering Ælfgifu after her death, because he was busy marrying Emma and needed to emphasize his new wife's legitimacy. Emma had every interest in forgetting Ælfgifu, because acknowledging her predecessor would have undermined Emma's own claims to preeminence. Ælfgifu's sons might have honored their mother's memory privately, but none of them lived long enough or succeeded well enough to commission works of history or monuments. So Ælfgifu was forgotten, not because she was unimportant, but because she was inconvenient. She didn't fit the narrative that powerful people wanted to tell. She was erased from history not by accident, but by design, by the deliberate choices of people who controlled the historical record. Understanding this process, the process by which some people are remembered and others are forgotten, is crucial for understanding history itself. History is not an objective record of everything that happened. It is a selective record of what powerful people chose to preserve. Reading history critically means asking, who is missing from this story? Whose voices have been silenced? Whose experiences have been erased? Third, Ælfgifu's story illuminates the lives of medieval women in ways that more famous women's stories cannot. Emma of Normandy's story is extraordinary. Crowned twice, married to 2 kings, wielding power, shaping events. But Emma's story is not typical. Most medieval queens did not wield that kind of power. Most medieval women, even elite women, lived lives more like Ælfgifu's, constrained by male authority, denied public roles, valuable primarily as bearers of children and makers of alliances. By studying Ælfgifu, we learn about what life was like for women who were not exceptional, who did not break the mold, who simply lived within the constraints that society imposed on them. We learn about arranged marriages and dynastic politics. We learn about the constant pregnancies and the dangers of childbirth. We learn about living in the shadows of more powerful people, about having no voice, no choice, no control over your own destiny. This is valuable knowledge. Understanding the normal, everyday experiences of people in the past helps us understand how societies functioned, what life was actually like for most people, not just for the exceptional few who appear in the history books. Fourth, Ælfgifu's story raises profound questions about legacy and success. In our culture, we tend to measure success in terms of achievements and accomplishments. What you did with your life, what you achieved, what you left behind. By these measures, Ælfgifu was a failure. She achieved nothing notable. She held no power. She left no mark on her time. But in the medieval world, legacy was measured differently. What mattered most was bloodline, producing children who would carry on your name and your heritage. By this measure, Ælfgifu was spectacularly successful. Her descendants include every English monarch for 900 years. Her genes have spread across the world. She is one of the most common ancestors of European royalty. Which measure of success is more meaningful? Is it better to have power and fame in your own lifetime but leave no descendants, like Emma? Or is it better to have no power or recognition, but to leave descendants who will carry your blood forever, like Ælfgifu? This question has no easy answer. Different people will answer it differently. But asking the question forces us to think about what we value, what we think matters in life, how we define success and legacy. Fifth, Ælfgifu's story is a reminder of the fragility and contingency of history. Small things, a woman's death, a king's decision to remarry, a massacre ordered in paranoia, can have enormous consequences that ripple forward through time in unpredictable ways. If Ælfgifu had not died in 1002, Æthelred could not have married Emma. If he had not married Emma, he would not have forged an alliance with Normandy. If Emma's sons had not grown up in Normandy, they would not have become culturally Norman. If Edward the Confessor had not been raised in Normandy and favoured Norman nobles, the political situation in 1066 might have been different. If William the Conqueror had not been able to claim that Edward had promised him the throne, he might not have invaded England. The entire course of English history might have been different. These contingencies remind us that history is not inevitable, not deterministic. Things could have gone differently at countless decision points. The world we live in is the product of millions of small choices and accidents, any one of which might have produced a radically different outcome. Sixth, Ælfgifu's story speaks to universal human experiences that transcend time and place. She was a daughter who grew up in a powerful family. She was a young woman who was married for political reasons to a man she might not have loved. She was a mother who bore many children and loved them and worried about their futures. She was a wife who endured a difficult marriage to a troubled man. She died young, leaving her children behind, unable to protect them from the storms that were coming. These experiences, arranged marriage, motherhood, worry about children, difficult relationships, untimely death, are not unique to medieval queens. They are human experiences that people in every time and place can understand and relate to. In reading about Ælfgifu, we are reading about ourselves, about our own fears and hopes and struggles, reflected in the life of a woman who lived 1,000 years ago. This is why history matters, not because it teaches us specific lessons or gives us simple answers to complex questions, but because it reminds us of our common humanity. The past is full of people who are just as human as we are, who face problems that resonate with our own problems, who struggled and loved and feared and hoped just like we do. Understanding their stories helps us understand ourselves. Finally, Ælfgifu's story matters because it is a story about justice delayed but not denied. For 1,000 years, Ælfgifu was forgotten. Her name appeared in a few documents, but no one knew who she was or why she mattered. Historians writing about Æthelred's reign focused on Emma and ignored or barely mentioned Ælfgifu. She was a footnote, a minor character, a woman who didn't matter. But in recent decades, historians have begun to recover Ælfgifu's story. They have pieced together the fragments of evidence, have read between the lines of the chronicles, have used genetic and genealogical analysis to trace her descendants. They have begun to give Ælfgifu the recognition she was denied in life. This recovery of forgotten women's stories is part of a larger project in historical scholarship, the project of making history more inclusive, more representative, more just. For too long, history was written by and about powerful men. Women, when they appeared at all, were marginal figures, but historians today are working to change that, to recover the stories of women who were written out of history, to give voice to the voiceless, to honor the forgotten. Ælfgifu's story is being told now, 1,000 years late, but told nonetheless. This is a kind of justice, incomplete and imperfect, but real. It cannot undo the injustices Ælfgifu suffered in life. It cannot restore to her the crown and recognition she was denied. But it can acknowledge that she mattered, that her life had meaning, that she deserves to be remembered. And perhaps, in some metaphysical sense, this belated recognition matters. Perhaps memory itself is a kind of immortality, a way of allowing the dead to live on in the minds of the living. If that is true, then Ælfgifu is living again, speaking again, mattering again. After 1,000 years of silence, she was forgotten, but she is remembered now. She was erased, but she has been recovered. She was voiceless, but historians are giving her voice. The forgotten queen has been found, and her story, once recovered, is too powerful to forget again. It will be told and retold, studied and analyzed, used as an example and a lesson for future generations. Ælfgifu of York, who lived and died in obscurity, has finally achieved a kind of fame. Not the fame she might have wanted, perhaps, but fame nonetheless. Her story matters because she matters. She was a human being who lived and loved and suffered and died. She was denied justice in life, but she can be granted recognition in death. She was the forgotten queen, and now she is remembered. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can do for the dead. Remember them, honor them, acknowledge that they lived and that their lives mattered. Perhaps that is the greatest gift we can give to those who came before us. The gift of memory, the gift of recognition, the gift of knowing that they are not forgotten. Ælfgifu of York, daughter of Thored, wife of Æthelred, mother of Edmund Ironside, ancestral mother of English kings. You are remembered now. Your story has been told. You have been found, and you will not be forgotten again. Dear listener, our journey through Ælfgifu's life has come to an end. We have traced her story from her birth in the northern mists of 10th century Yorkshire to her lonely death 1,000 years ago. We have explored her obscure life, her powerless marriage, her forgotten death. We have followed the thread of her blood forward through the centuries, watching it flow through Edmund Ironside and his descendants, through Margaret of Scotland and Henry III's queen, through the Plantagenets and Tudors and Stuarts and Hanoverians, down to the present day. We have seen how a woman who was denied recognition in life became the ancestral mother of dynasties. We have seen how a queen who was erased from history ultimately triumphed through the survival of her bloodline. We have seen how the forgotten can be remembered, how the voiceless can speak again through the work of historians who refuse to let them be forgotten. Ælfgifu's story is a sad one in many ways. She lived a life of constraint and limitation. She was married for political reasons to a man who probably didn't love her. She bore him many children but received no recognition for her service. She was denied the crown and the title that should have been hers. She died young, forgotten almost immediately, buried in an unmarked grave that has never been found. But Ælfgifu's story is also a triumphant one. Her blood survived when Emma's did not. Her descendants ruled England when Emma's line died out. The forgotten queen became more important, in the end, than the remembered one. Ælfgifu won the game that mattered most in the medieval world, the game of dynastic survival. And now, finally, after 1,000 years of obscurity, Ælfgifu is being remembered. Her story is being told. Historians are acknowledging her importance, recognizing her as a key figure in the royal lineage, giving her the honor she was denied in life. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, remember Ælfgifu. Remember that she lived, that she mattered, that she was human like you and me. Remember that history is full of forgotten people whose stories deserve to be told. Remember that even the most powerless people can have profound impacts on the future. That even the most forgotten people can be remembered again if someone takes the time to look for them. Ælfgifu's blood flows through the centuries, connecting the 10th century to the 21st, connecting a forgotten northern noblewoman to the current British royal family. We are all connected to the past in ways we often don't realize, all descended from countless forgotten people who lived and loved and died without leaving their names in the history books. So sleep now, and as you sleep, let your mind wander through the centuries. Imagine Ælfgifu in her bower, spinning wool and wondering what her children's futures will hold. Imagine Edmund Ironside on the battlefield, fighting against impossible odds. Imagine Edward the Exile growing up in distant Hungary, dreaming of the England he has never seen. Imagine Margaret of Scotland civilizing her rough warrior husband, founding churches and promoting learning. Imagine all the forgotten people, all the silent voices, all the lives that mattered but left no trace. History is not just about kings and battles and great events. It is also about ordinary people living ordinary lives, about women like Ælfgifu, who endured what they had to endure, who did what was expected of them, who loved their children and hoped for better futures. These people matter. Their stories matter. And when we remember them, we honor not just them, but all the forgotten people who came before us and whose sacrifices and struggles made our world possible. Ælfgifu of York, daughter, wife, mother, queen without a crown, forgotten woman, ancestral mother of dynasties, we remember you, we honor you, we acknowledge that you lived and that your life mattered. May you rest in peace wherever you are buried. May your memory be honored. May your story never be forgotten again. And may all of us, as we drift off to sleep, remember the forgotten, honor the erased, acknowledge the voiceless. For in doing so, we make the world a little more just, history a little more complete, and the past a little less silent. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. Dream of queens and warriors, of forgotten lives and remembered legacies, of blood flowing forward through the centuries, connecting past to present, linking us all in a great chain of being that stretches back to the beginning of time. Ælfgifu watches over you from 1,000 years away, this forgotten queen who was mother to us all. Sleep now, and remember, the story is told. The forgotten queen has been remembered. Rest now in peace, knowing that history, however slowly, ultimately does justice to those it once forgot. Good night, sleep well, and remember Ælfgifu.